Before we begin today's topic, I want to ask you something honestly. Why are you preparing for UGC NET Psychology? Is it just for a certificate, or is it because you truly want to understand the mind, behavior, society, and yourself? Many students think UGC NET is about memorizing theories, dates, and names, but real psychology, and especially Indian psychology, is about meaning, context, struggle, and transformation. Today's topic, that is academic psychology in India, is not just a syllabus unit. It is the story of our discipline, the identity crisis of Indian psychology, and the journey from imitation to innovation. Many aspirants feel confused by this topic. They say it is too abstract, that the periods overlap, and that examiners ask unpredictable questions. And they are right. This is one of the most misunderstood yet most frequently tested topics in Unit 1. But by the end of this video, you will not just remember it, you will understand it. You will be able to predict UGC NET questions, and you will feel confident saying, I own this topic. Let us begin this journey not as viewers but as future NET qualifiers. Let us go back to pre-1947 India, when psychology entered the country not as a native discipline but as a colonial import. Psychology during the pre-independence era was completely shaped by Western models. The British educational system introduced psychology mainly as an academic subject modeled on German experimental psychology and British empirical tradition. The first psychological laboratory in India was established in 1915 at Calcutta University by N. Sen Gupta, a fact that is frequently tested in UGC NET. But what is more important than the date or name is the nature of psychology at that time. It was highly experimental, heavily quantitative, entirely Western in concepts, and almost disconnected from Indian social realities. Indian psychologists were not studying Indian minds, they were testing Western theories on Indian populations. There was little concern for culture, context, or lived experience. From an examiner's point of view, psychology in the pre-independence period is best described as Western oriented, experimental, and culturally detached. Emotionally, this was a period of intellectual dependency. Despite India's rich traditions in the Upanishads, yoga, Buddhism, and other systems of thought, academic psychology ignored them completely. This was not merely a methodological issue, it was a loss of identity. When India gained political independence in 1947, one might expect psychology to gain intellectual independence as well. However, that did not happen immediately. The post-independent era saw rapid expansion in psychology. Universities established new psychology departments, research output increased, and applied fields such as educational psychology, clinical psychology, and industrial psychology grew significantly. Psychology became more institutionalized and professionally organized. However, the theoretical foundations remained largely Western. Psychological tests used in India were most standardized Western tools, and research continued to rely heavily on Western concepts and models. Psychology grew quantitatively but not qualitatively in terms of cultural relevance. From the examiner's perspective, post-independence psychology is best described as expansion with continued Western dominance. Emotionally, this period reflects a contradiction. India was politically free yet academically dependent. Students studied the mind in a country where family, spirituality, community, and collective identity were central, but their textbooks spoke almost exclusively about Freud, Skinner, Piaget, and Eysenck without any Indian lens. This was growth without roots. The 1970s marked a turning point in Indian psychology. Psychologists began to ask a critical question: what is the use of psychology if it does not address the real problems of Indian society? This decade witnessed a strong shift towards social relevance. Psychology began engaging with issues such as poverty, illiteracy, mental health, gender inequality, and social justice. Instead of remaining confined to laboratories and classrooms, psychologists moved into villages, communities, schools, and hospitals. Field research, community psychology, and applied social research gained importance. Psychology started to serve people rather than institutions. From an examiner's perspective, the 1970s are best characterized by the move towards addressing social issues. This period reflects a moral awakening within the discipline psychology. Psychology began to recognize its responsibility towards society and human welfare rather than merely producing academic knowledge. The 1980s were revolutionary for Indian psychology. Psychologists began to ask a bold and transformative question: why are we using Western psychology to understand Indian minds? This led to the indigenization movement, one of the most significant turning points in the history of Indian psychology. Indigenization refers to the development of psychological concepts, theories, and methods that are rooted in Indian culture, philosophy, and lived experience. Psychologists began to draw from Indian traditions such as yoga, Vedanta, Buddhism, and Bhakti movements to understand concepts like self, mind, emotion, motivation, and well being. This movement did not reject Western psychology, but it refused to blindly copy it. Instead, it emphasized contextual relevance, cultural sensitivity, and conceptual originality. From the examiner's point of view, the 1980s are associated with indigenization, and indigenization refers to developing culturally relevant psychological knowledge. Emotionally, this was the moment Indian psychology began to reclaim its voice. It was a discipline saying, we do not need to borrow our mind from the West, we can understand ourselves from ourselves. The 1990s were intellectually intense and emotionally complex for Indian psychology. This period was marked by paradigmatic concerns and a disciplinary identity crisis. Psychologists found themselves caught between Western scientific rigor and Indian philosophical depth. This led to serious debates about the nature, methods, and goals of psychology. Should Indian psychology follow positivist, quantitative, and experimental methods, or should it adopt qualitative, interpretative, and experiential approaches? Should psychology be a natural science, a social science, a human science, or a spiritual discipline? These questions created uncertainty and confusion about the identity of the discipline. From the examiner's perspective, the 1990s are associated with paradigmatic concerns and disciplinary identity crisis. This crisis refers to uncertainty about theoretical foundations, methodological approaches, and the very nature of psychological knowledge. Emotionally, this phase resembles adolescence, confused, questioning, restless, but also necessary for growth. Without this crisis, Indian psychology could never have matured into a coherent and confident discipline. The 2000s marked the emergence of Indian psychology in academia as a recognized and legitimate field of study. Indian psychology was no longer seen as merely philosophical or alternative. It gained academic status through research journals, university courses, conferences, and scholarly communities. This period emphasized integration rather than opposition. Indian psychology began integrating Indian philosophical insights with scientific methods, combining experiential wisdom and empirical rigor. The focus shifted towards concepts such as consciousness, self, well being, emotional regulation, mindfulness, and human flourishing. From the examiner's perspective, the emergence of Indian psychology in academia occurred in the 2000s, and it is best characterized by the integration of Indian thought and scientific approaches. Emotionally, this is our era. This is a time when Indian psychology stands with confidence, not in imitation, not in rejection, but in meaningful integration. Now let me speak to you directly as an aspirant preparing for UGC NET. The examiners will not ask this topic only in the form of simple factual questions. They will test your conceptual clarity, your understanding of chronological development, your ability to compare phases, and your grasp of critical issues. You may be asked to arrange developments in correct order, to match decades with movements, to evaluate assertion reason statements, to identify characteristics of specific periods, or to analyze the identity crisis and paradigmatic concerns. They may ask which decade marked indigenization, which period focused on social issues, what characterizes post independence psychology, or what the emergence of Indian psychology signifies. If you understand why each phase emerged, not just when it occurred, you will be able to answer any form of question confidently. Academic psychology in India is not merely a historical narrative, it is a journey of intellectual self discovery, a struggle for academic independence, and a movement towards cultural relevance. It reflects how a discipline evolves from imitation to innovation, from dependency to identity, from abstraction to application, and from isolation to integration. This is not just history, this is our academic lineage. You are not merely preparing for an exam, you are becoming a part of a tradition that seeks to understand the human mind in ways that are scientifically sound, culturally grounded, and socially meaningful. Before you leave, I want you to take one more step towards your success. I have shared a Google form in the description with UGC NET style practice question based on today's lecture. Attempt them honestly, test your understanding, and strengthen your preparation. And if you are serious about qualifying UGC NET Psychology, subscribe to this channel, because this channel is not just about content, it's about your growth, your clarity, and your success.